Hi there and welcome to Project Hospital. Yep, indeed, I am back in Project Hospital. And so I know I concluded this realistic hospital series a while ago, and that was on the basis that we'd added every department. However, with the recent release of the Traumatology DLC, I thought this realistic playthrough might be worth a revisit. The only thing is, instead of entangling that mess that became of our first hospital, and my goodness did that become a mess, instead of using that one, I'm going to start fresh and build a one-off major trauma hospital. So the entire hospital is going to be dedicated to trauma treatment, and that means we'll only have the trauma department and the associated clinical adjacencies in the building. So I've had a play around with this already, and I've mapped out where things are going to be on the ground floor. Now, unlike the last playthrough where we just ended up with one giant square building, I'm playing around a little bit with this, making this one more a collection of buildings. So there's going to be dedicated buildings for each specific thing. First off, we have the emergency department down here. Now, because I'm playing this as being a major trauma hospital, I've got the emergency clinic sharing space with the traumatology clinic. Now, that's because if we were playing this realistically, I think most patients coming into the major trauma hospital, they would be going through emergency. I mean, you might get follow-up appointments to check up on an ongoing condition going through a dedicated traumatology doctor's office, but in-game, follow-up appointments don't exist. Our patients come in with a variety of illnesses, they get it treated, sent to another hospital, or they ultimately die. There isn't any lengthy recovery process that would happen in real life. So what I might do is I might reserve some space on the floors above this that would be set aside for a dedicated traumatology unit. But in-game, they won't be used. Now, the way I've set this up, once the space is filled with all the equipment, it should all look like one department, even though it's actually two. So yeah, that's the building where people are going to come into the hospital if they're coming in off their own back. Now, next to here, we have the trauma centre. Now, that's still part of the emergency department, but it's for the more emergency cases. And this is where the emergency stuff like people on the trolleys are going to come in from an ambulance, which is why we've got the ambulance drop-off right here. Now, the other option with these types of patients, they could be coming in from an air ambulance, since they've added air ambulances in the last DLC. Now, I'll be going into the air ambulances in a little more detail a bit later on because we have to put it on the roof. And there is a reason behind that, but I'll get to that when we get to the roof. Anyway, so I have an external corridor connecting these two buildings, and this is something that you'll see a lot in real hospitals. There will usually always be a way of connecting interdependent departments indoors, even if they're in different buildings. Now, I think that's due to health and safety concerns more than anything else. I mean, when you've got a lot of frail people moving about, it's always going to be better to keep them sheltered indoors than forcing them out between departments. So I've got a few of these corridors set up to connect buildings where you're going to see a lot of patient transfers. You'll notice I don't have a corridor on this building, and that's because this is where the labs are going to be set up. Now, I know in game, people travel to the labs to hand their samples in, then they wait around here for the results to come back. That's acceptable in the game, but realistically, in any hospital I've been in, that's not going to happen. You hand your samples over to a nurse, or if it's something like a urine test that you've had to do at home, there's normally a sample drop-off point where you hand it in there. In a newly built, modernised hospital, your lab staff aren't going to need to interact with actual patients at all. So I've tried to mimic that by giving the labs their own building, and it's not connected to anything else with any of these external corridors. I mean, I'll live with the fact that they have to have waiting rooms in there, but it's not realistic in my opinion. Something else I've got here where I have used a little bit of artistic license, I've got the pharmacy here and the gift shop, and they're both set up as external buildings as well. Now, in most cases, you're going to get your gift shop and you're going to get your pharmacy inside the hospital itself. Probably for security more than anything for the pharmacy at least. I just felt that if I was going to add these two things to the building, then they'd need to be in this central building I've got here, and the room's already going to get quite tight in there. Right, so the layout of where these medical departments are, I've tried to follow the classic patient pathway through the building. So these big external buildings are where patients start their journey, then further treatment is located centrally within this big main building. Now, this is pretty much where all diagnosis and treatment is going to go on from there. The external buildings on the other side. Up here is the labs, which we've already talked about, and next to this is where pathology is going to be, so that's where those that have passed away will be taken. Now, I do have an external corridor connecting pathology to the main building, and that's basically for privacy and dignity reasons. I mean, last thing you want to be doing is looking out the window in the main building, watching all the dead bodies get dropped off at pathology, so that's why that's there. Anyway, I'm going to fill in this ground floor off camera and then cut back when that's done. Okay, so that's the ground floor filled in. So to run through a little of what I have here, I did explain a lot of this in the first episode of the Real Hospital series, but some of it I've tweaked a little bit to suit a trauma hospital. So the thing is with the trauma hospital, a vital concept in the design of the emergency clinics is based around what's called the golden hour. Now, that's where effective care within the first 60 minutes of somebody sustaining a traumatic injury, that's likely to have significant impact on the patient's health outcomes. It's essential to have an effective trauma system in place where it's easy to get from one section of treatment to another as quickly as possible. So that's how I've laid this out. That's why the trauma clinics I have here are much larger than what I had in my last build. There's 9 trauma bays split here across 2 wards, and with room to accommodate lots of staff in the 2 offices here. The nurses' station is separated from the bays, but the big glass walls give them direct line of sight to the bays at all times. Across from this, I have the observation ward. Now, there's not as many beds in here, but again, there's plenty of space for staff adjacent to this. I've also designed the floor here to be staff only, but with patients allowed with permission. So hopefully that means you only get patients in this area that need to be here. I want this section of the building to be restricted because any trauma centre, you want the floor traffic reduced as much as possible. Same goes in the radiology section of the building. This size has the same restrictions as the trauma centre because I want this to only be used by inpatients. So those coming from wards on the floors above this when we build those. Outpatients, so those not yet admitted for hospital treatment, they'll use this side for radiology tests because they'll be coming from the emergency care and the traumatology doctor's offices here, so that's an easy route for them to get through. I'm a little worried there might not be enough radiology rooms in this build because I've only got 1 of each aside from 2 x-ray machines, but considering I'm only having trauma care here, we might be okay. I'm not sure how it plays out yet. Anyway, other things I've got going on here. Oh yeah, so this room down here in the traumatology emergency care, this is designated as a staff room, but I've kitted this out as what would be a visitor's quiet room. Now, people coming into trauma, you're not going to be able to have visitors wandering around here. You're going to want it, like, the space free for the care, and you don't want to be distracted by distraught relatives. So what you'd have with that is you would have quiet rooms set up adjacent to the centre, just a place for relatives to be. Now, this kind of mechanic doesn't exist in game, so I've just kind of kitted out a staff room to be that room. Visitors won't use it, but at least I know it's there. Something else I've changed up this time, there's more internal courtyards. Now, something I've been looking into, outdoor space, or at the very least a view of outdoor space, helps significantly with patients' recovery. It's something to do with the mind. So when you're thinking about treating patients, you have to think about what's beneficial for the mind because it does interrelate to beneficial health outcomes. In a similar vein, the same goes for staff morale. Now, you have to imagine working in a trauma centre, particularly trauma emergency care, that's got to be one hell of a stressful job. Staff need places they can go for quiet reflection, space for recuperation from tough situations. That's why I've paid particular attention this time to making sure there's plenty of outside courtyard space and also plenty of staff rooms dotted about. You've got to look after your staff as well as the patients. Everything else here, I guess, is the pretty basic workspace setup. Although, if you have noticed here, in the stretcher storage, we do now have wheelchairs. And you know what? I am so happy about the wheelchairs. I've been asking for wheelchairs since launch. This is like so much more realistic. You only need to transport very frail or seriously ill patients via stretcher. So add in the wheelchair. It's so much more common for them to use wheelchairs for transporting patients around. I look forward to seeing these in use. Now all we need is some orderly staff, because I know in game you have the nurses transporting patients around, but in real life that would be an orderly's job. You'd have a team of orderlies on hand for patient transfers and also lifting operations, so where patients can't lift themselves, they need moving in and out of beds and stuff. Right, anyway, so that is the ground floor complete, so onwards and upwards to the first level. I think, like the ground floor, I will set this out off camera and jump back for the details. Right, I'm back and the first floor is now complete. So up here we have the second level of the laboratory building, so basically just a staff room there and the histology lab. Then these three buildings, so the emergency and traumatology clinic and the pharmacy and gift shop, oh, and the pathology up at the top, they don't need a second level, so I've closed these off with a basic roof structure. Into this big main building, this is where the core activities take place. So we have the traumatology ward, which is actually the burns unit in-game. Now, it's interesting the game went for a specialist burns unit, but didn't add just a normal trauma ward here. Maybe that's because we already have the trauma centre included with the emergency department. Who knows? Anyway, this ward is serviced by its own nurses station, and I've separated the wards out into individual rooms. This is because, well, where hospitals can, single bedrooms are favourable, obviously all with their own ensuite facilities, and all have good levels of natural light, and a view across the courtyard below, so that should be good for patients and should keep them relatively happy in here. This is kind of the best setup you could wish for, to be honest, if you find yourself unfortunate enough to be needing a stay in a hospital. So, up above this is where I've placed the operating theatres. We've got 3 theatres and the associated officers for nurses and doctors to run these. There's no windows in the theatres, and that's for infection prevention and control measures. Adding a window is going to add an extra level of risk, and it's going to need extra cleaning. So when the patient isn't going to benefit from having natural light here, there's no point putting it in. So because it won't make a difference to the care, there's basically going to be no windows here. Below the theatres is where I've got the diagnostics unit set up, and I've placed these here because they will get used a lot, and this is a nice central location for all the wards. And for the general clinic downstairs too. We might get some outpatients coming up here for diagnostics, and they will access diagnostics via the elevator here. So this will bypass all of the wards entirely, and that's a good thing. You don't want outpatients having to go through wards or ward corridors to get to diagnostics. Now, this big empty space here, I was going to add a visitor lounge here. However, neither the Traumatology DLC or the emergency department has the option for visitors, so you only get the lounge option with the other departments. Now, I'm wondering if that means we're going to get any visitors at all. I mean, I could have set up with a different department and just put in the visitor centre up here, but I feel like if they're not going to use it, what's the point putting it in? Anyway, I kind of ran out of time to do anything else with this space, so I've kind of just left it blank for now. Maybe I'll think of something to do with it in the future. So that's the main central building done. Below this, we're moving into the more urgent care section of the hospital. So on the ground floor, you have the trauma centre and the observation ward. And above this on the first floor, I've got the high dependency unit and the intensive care here. Now, these wards are laid out a little differently than the general ward over in the other building. For the HDU and intensive care, it's much less likely you're going to have single bedrooms, and that's just because it's easier for nurses to keep an eye on patients when they're all clustered together. Privacy and dignity isn't so much an issue on these wards because patients are going to be in a much worse condition and they may not even be conscious. What you can get in real hospitals is you'll have a HDU with, say, 8 beds. Then you might have adjacent to that a room with just 1 bed in, and that's for patients that need to be isolated, so those that need the HDU care, but maybe they've got a compromised immune system or something, so they need to have their own single room for infection prevention and control reasons. I didn't really have the room here to add a single bedroom, so I've just stuck with the 2 8-bed wards for HDU, and over in intensive care we have 1 8-bed unit here. All 3 of these wards have a lot of natural light though, and I've given more space around the beds because in an emergency situation, doctors and nurses would do better with a lot of space to do their job to stabilise the patient. Now, both HDU wards have their own bathroom, but that's not going to be necessary with an ICU. Patients in ICU aren't going to be moving around that much. As far as staff interaction goes, for the HDUs, I have windows that mean nurses have a good line of sight to the patients at all time, but their workstation isn't adjacent. As for the ICU, I've ramped that up a bit so that you have viewpoints into the room, and the nurse's station is adjacent for urgent action if needed. So you can kind of see between all of the wards the balance between patients' privacy and the need for staff to have sight lines of patients. So for the general ward, there's a lot more privacy there since patients don't need to be monitored as closely. In the HDU, we've got some privacy, but not as much as the general ward. And in ICU, privacy isn't really a priority at this point. It's more about the care of the patient. Anyway, so that's all the wards I've incorporated into this hospital, and that's every treatment and clinical room to look after the emergency services, the traumatology, and the intensive care. So next, I guess we get to look at the roof. Yes, so we're looking at the roof because that's where we put in our helipad. So here we go, we're on the roof, and there is our lovely helipad. Now, you may be wondering why I chose to put the helipad on the roof rather than on the ground. Well, there was a bit of design planning behind that decision. You see, in real life, building one on the roof is going to cost significantly more, but it offers benefits such as greater privacy and easier access since patients won't need to be transported across the grounds. And it's less hazardous since the pilot has an obstacle-free route to land. Since helicopter-borne patients are likely to be in a time-critical condition, it's important that the time to transfer them between helicopter and the trauma centre is as short as possible. Where I've positioned this helipad on the roof, the elevator going down here sits right above the ICU and the trauma centre, so they're in a very good position to get treatment as quickly as possible. Putting the helipad on the ground, now yes, in real life that's going to be much cheaper and much easier in most instances, but realistically, in the game, it's not even viable to have one on the ground. It would sit far too close to the road and the other buildings themselves, and that creates a real health and safety hazard. The helipad and surrounding area, it must be free from all obstructions so that they can actually land it without difficulty. There's no way that you get planning permission for building one on the ground in this scenario because it's just far too close to buildings, pedestrians and the road. I don't know if you've seen helicopters when they land, but they create a pretty hefty downward flow of air called downwash, and this can blow up grit or debris, so obviously you don't want that near to a building or people causing damage. It's a health and safety risk. Can you imagine all the frail people and pensioners walking past the helipad and getting knocked off their feet by the air pressure? Yeah, that wouldn't do, would it? So realistically, in this build, my only option was to add our helipad to the roof, and you know, I think it fits in quite well up there, to be honest. Anyway, so the rest of this, I added this little building on the side which houses the elevator down. Thought I'd give them a little bit of an enclosure there for it. Everything else I've done, I've cleaned up the outside decor a bit. I've added some different textures to the walls so it helps distinguish the individual buildings. This is exactly like a real hospital that gets built up over time. They'll add new wings, they'll knock down old sections, they'll connect it all up in funky ways with prefab corridors, and you end up with hospitals looking a lot like this. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this build. I'm going to look into adding this to the Steam Workshop. Just need to figure out how I do that with this game and whether there's even any interest. That's it for me today, so thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.